All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Isabella. I'm marketing here at Teachstone. We're so excited to get started with you today on this awesome webinar. We have two really special hosts and panelists with us today who are going to share some really great stuff with you. As you enter, I just want to let you know that this is being recorded and you will have the opportunity to ask us questions using the Q&A box. You can also use the chat that should be open at this point. But if you have a question for Dominique or Claudia and you really want to make sure that it gets answered, I do recommend using that Q&A feature as it's just more likely to be seen. So feel free at this time to introduce yourself in the chat. We're going to get those slides up here momentarily and get started with everyone today. So feel free to let us know in the chat where you're coming from and what your role is in your organization. And we'll get the slides going here in a second. And just a reminder that if you are joining us late today, you will have the opportunity to see this whole thing in full when we send out the recording later this week. So if you're just getting started with us today, this is Leaders You Can Improve School Climate with Meaningful Interactions. And we're going to be diving into that topic with our two panelists. So Rachel, we can get the next slide. Again, use the chat box, use the Q&A, and don't worry if you come in late or if you have to step away early. We will be sending you a copy of today's presentation as well as the slides and other resources that we discuss. Right, so let's get going. If you haven't already, you introduce yourself in the chat. And we also want to hear about you. So I'm launching a poll so you can tell us a little bit about your role in your organization. And if you do something else that's not represented here, feel free to let us know in the chat. It looks like we have a lot of site directors, principals, administrators, quite a few instructional leaders, which is awesome, and a handful of educators. So welcome, everyone. We're excited to have you all. Okay, Rachel, we can move on to our next slide. Thank you. So today, just a bit of a rundown of what we'll be covering. We're going to be talking about what makes a good workplace, leveraging interactions to create a positive school climate, scaling support through well-being initiatives, and then at the end, we will have some time for Q&A. We'll also probably be answering some questions throughout the presentation. So just a reminder, if you do have a really pressing question that you want us to see, make sure to use that Q&A box so that it gets to us. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to our lovely panelists today. We have Claudia Perez, who's a senior development lead here at Teachstone, and Dominique McCain, who, if you've come to other events before, you've probably seen, who is our senior impact consultant. So welcome to both of you, and I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Isabella. So happy to be here with you all. Thank you so much for joining us. We know how busy your day-to-day is, how much you do, and we just can't wait to spend some time with you here today and hopefully share some information that will be practical for you.
Hello, everyone. It's always my pleasure to be able to speak about the work that I've done. And so I'm grateful to be here with you all, and I hope you all can glean some insight from the things that Claudia and I share with you today.
All right, so thank you for introducing yourselves in the chat. I know that some of you have already written your role in your program, but more specifically, let us know, what role are you playing right now to create an empowering culture in your program? What are some things that you're doing to create this culture in your program? reflective supervision, creating clear norms with the team. Norms are always so helpful to align, right, across the board. Devoting time to invest in reflection, coaching, mentoring, helpful hands. So many great things that y'all are already doing. And the great thing about these webinars is that you all can also get ideas from one another in the chat. I know it's hard to keep up with because there's so much being written at the same time, but I'm seeing some really awesome things here. We're going to talk about, yes, creating that trusting environment, which sounds like a simple thing, but there's a lot that goes into that, right? Developing my craft as a coach, staff wellness. We're going to talk about that too. Making it strength-based and about, yep, what the coachee wants to work on. Awesome. Keep those coming. And Dominique, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Claudia. We can go to the next slide. So we have heard, and you may have heard this as well, people don't leave jobs, they leave people. One of the things that I think is really important based on what I've seen you all share in the chat is that many of the things that you're doing right now are really about how do we build collective understanding? How do we build collective language? How do we build, if you will, all of those things like norms and coaching and check-ins? You all are working hard to create the space for what we would refer to as interactions, right? Let's go to the next slide. So people leave bad interactions. Ultimately, and I love that you all are doing such amazing work to build positive work environments, because there is this kind of anchoring of understanding that we do not exist on teams in isolation. And the moment we use the word team, we now have to create rules of engagement because everybody is coming from a very different place. And so what I want to share specifically as we think about that kind of line of thinking, people don't leave jobs, they leave people, which inevitably means a bad interaction or a series of bad interactions or several bad interactions can inevitably lead to staff change, turnover, things that those of us who are in leadership roles are thinking about all the time. And so I hope that as we go through the webinar today, you all are able to pull some insights on how do you leverage the system of class, the tools you're getting through the system of class to really add value in other spaces, not just the classroom, right? Let's go to the next slide. And so as we have the conversation, we've got to talk about how do we center everything we're doing, from the culture, the work environment, every part of the ecosystem, and I'm using that word intentionally. How do we center everything in the ecosystem around interactions? Ultimately, we have to acknowledge that it is our interactions that inevitably become our experience. I'm using air quotes because these are the words that I use, but you may call it something different. Do we as leaders have a very clear and strong understanding that really what we have to do to build positive environments and work environments is create the space and the rules of engagement to constantly improve the interactions that are happening between the adults in those spaces? Next slide. And so what inevitably is the impact of intentional interactions? I know if you're on this call, you're familiar with the class system to some degree, you're probably always focused on those educator-child interactions. Now we're talking about adult interactions. And it's important to note the impact is the same. I think this has an animation in it. So click on this slide, whoever's running the slideshow. I don't have a script, y'all. I could, but I choose not to because I like to show up organically. Click again, please, if you don't mind. I'm one of those people that I need to see all of the words. Ultimately, this is what we're in service to share with you today, is just reframing and rethinking how do we leverage interactions in multiple spaces to the advantage of everyone that we're serving, whether that's our staff, whether that's our students, whether that's our parents. Ultimately, the impact of high quality and positive interactions is the same. When people feel connected, engaged, and inspired, they thrive. Whether that connection is happening with other adults, whether it's happening in hierarchical arrangements. When we go to work, somebody's the boss and somebody's not. And in reality, there is automatically a dynamic, a power dynamic, if we want to be frank. There's a power dynamic that gets set up there. What is it that allows us to ensure that that power dynamic doesn't damage relationships? It's ultimately being very intentional about the interactions, creating the space for those interactions to be high quality and positive to the degree that we have that control. Next slide, please. So we want to give you some examples of what intentional interactions might look like in the work environment. The examples here on the slide are just a few. I'd love for you, if you have the opportunity, throw some in the chat if these bring up ideas for you. So a director builds trust with their staff through active listening and demonstrating empathy and cultural responsiveness. There is never a situation where we can interact and not converse. And when we converse, that interaction can go right or left. It can go good or bad. We all have our own language. We all have our own ways of expressing things. And so when we think about how we're interacting more intentionally, sometimes it gets to, do we have the same language? Are we using the same words to mean the same thing? I don't mean, do we speak the same language? Hopefully, if we're communicating with each other, we're speaking the same language. But even the language of our atmosphere, what are the words that we use when we mean specific things? Class and using the system of class gives you the opportunity to have some common language in your work environment. And so another example would be a lead teacher offers their para choice of activities and provides chances for increased responsibility to support autonomy. These examples hopefully are helping you to kind of generate your own thinking and examples of where have you been intentional with interactions that you would deem to be moving you in the direction or helping you to maintain a positive work environment and work culture. Last example on the slide is a coach uses feedback loops with an educator by asking follow-up questions that lead to a deeper understanding of concepts. I think, given that we are experiencing the system of class, that coach example is probably the most familiar. But I want you to think about, and I will name from my own experience, I've never been in a check-in with my staff where I wasn't coaching them. I've never been in a check-in with my staff where we weren't having deep discussions around their scopes of work. And the way we have those discussions really does either move us forward in our relationship or move us back in our relationship, right? And so the reality is when we are engaging with each other, those adult interactions also require us to show up in some of the ways that our class training has taught us. Are we being an active listener and having regard for the perspective of the other person? All of those things play into how our intentional interactions can look when we really are trying to build this positive work culture, positive work environment. Let's go to the next slide. Is this mine, Claudia, or is this yours? This is probably mine.
And I was gonna share one other example actually that I witnessed. It wasn't me personally doing it, but I did witness this at a program I worked in, where a director was meeting with their staff to get input on the observation protocol that they were gonna be using at their program. And the sense of trust and community and ownership that created for those teachers, that they had inputs over the observation protocols, really just changed the game, right? And it really made them feel like these observations weren't happening to them, but they really were a part of this. They had a say in this. Their voice mattered in this. Such a critical part of the day-to-day and the program procedures, right? So just wanted to share that example. But yeah, so this is all great in theory, right? But it can feel really hard to center your school, your program around interactions without a shared sense of a common language, like Dominique was saying, right? The concept of interactions may seem really straightforward, but as you all know, it's really complex, right? And there's a lot to unpack in order to really understand what's behind effective interaction. So class, as we know, is used in programs and school districts across the United States and across overseas even. And we spend a lot of time using class to think about the interactions between educators and children. But the great news is that we can also use class to help us with those adult interactions that are so important to creating our positive work culture. So on the next slide, you'll see the 3 domains of the class that a lot of you are familiar with, but for those of you who are joining us and are not familiar with the class, essentially the class sorts interactions into these 3 categories or domains: emotional support, classroom organization, and instructional support. So again, these apply, the class is built on this foundational interactions framework, which can apply to interactions with adults. So when you think about emotional support, you can think of a trusted friend, right, who listens to you and offers you encouragement and is really there and believes you when you tell them you're feeling frustrated or upset about something and is encouraging you. When we think about classroom organization, you can think about hosting a family dinner, right? And when you have planned the menu and set the table ahead of time and things are in order, you can relax and enjoy your time with your family. And when we think about instructional support, you can think of a mentor who challenges you with these like thought-provoking questions, helps you connect the dots and really take your thinking to the next level. Next slide. And I saw somebody already in the chat say that, Jan, that as a coach, you try to parallel the class dimensions while coaching. So exactly, right? The class parallel process, right? So the beauty of class, like I said, is that we can apply that same foundational framework. It's not something else that you have to learn or bring or think through, right? Like it's really there for you to support you in every interaction that you're having. So that's what the class parallel process refers to, is that idea that those same types of supportive, effective interactions that our kiddos really need and benefit from also apply and are critical to how adults interact with one another. So we know that when we model positive interactions across the board, right, between coaches and teachers, administrators and staff, and between teachers, the environment that we work in really just takes a 180. So there's actually a study from 2023 that found that teachers with positive workplace relationships were nearly 4 times more likely to remain in their current roles, right, as compared to teachers that are lacking those relationships. So when we think about turnover, which is something that we're all facing, creating those positive environments really is just critical. So educators are just really able to show up for kids in ways that support them when they themselves are really being supported. All right, so next slide. When we look at organizations and companies outside of our field of education, companies aim for this like best workplace award, right? Why? Well, because as we know, these awards can bring more talent, more benefits, enhance their reputation, improve their recruitment, improve their retention, right? And ultimately, it just contributes to a better business performance. But when you look at the items and the things that the assessments of what it means to be a great workplace, what those things are measuring and what these awards are looking at. Take a wild guess. They are getting to the heart of interactions, right? Like that's a big part of what they're measuring is the quality of interactions. Next slide. So here you can see some examples of the types of things that these companies, these assessments are looking for in companies. And we can easily see how some of these align with the indicators, right, of the class. So trust, that emotional connection and validating needs, consistency and clear leadership. We can easily see the connection of that to the indicators under behavior management. Fair treatment and inclusive environments. We can see that in the emphasis on the experience of every child and every individual that the class second edition really gets at. Recognition, right? When we think about quality of feedback, that encouragement and affirmation, that recognition of effort, and that encouragement of persistence is really what that's getting at. Engagement, right? When we think about ILF, instructional learning formats, that active participation, that listening, that focused attention, and of course, productivity, as you all know, is that its own dimension under classroom organization. So it's so clear that by investing in these everyday interactions with the folks who work in our programs, it goes a long way. And Amber in the chat was saying how they are working on gaining strategies to build emotional regulation skills in adults, right? Like, how hard is it for us to show up every day and regulate our own emotions and baggage and everything we bring in order to show up for these kids? How much harder does that become if we are in an environment that is not helping us regulate, that is not showing up in ways that are supporting us and feeling trusted, valued, and at peace, right? And Anna in the chat was talking about how she takes time to listen, right? So something so simple that when we're going 1,000 miles per hour, we can just forget, right? But people could tell when you're really listening and you're really there and present, and that goes such a long way. So Dominique is going to tell us a little bit more from her own experience with implementing this.
Let's go to the next slide. So I want to share just a little bit about how the system of class actually changed our entire department. A little bit of my background. I formerly worked in Dallas ISD. We had a department of over 200 people. And as you can imagine, 200 people interacting every day around early learning is a lot of interacting. If you go to the next slide, please. We started this journey together where we absolutely built a strategy specifically around our pre-K through second grade classrooms, and we were continually refining this and adjusting based on data. But the key here is that we anchored all of that work in the system of class because, one, we wanted to be able to collect data that helped us understand how were those interactions impacting our student outcomes. And so similar to most of you, it was class, and the use of class was a part of our strategy toward meeting our goals that were explicitly work outcomes, or in my case, student outcomes. Well, something very interesting happened. We first had a leader who I'll name in this moment, Dr. Derek Little, who at the time was the Deputy Superintendent of Early Learning in Dallas ISD, and he was our supervisor. So the way we were set up, we had one deputy superintendent. There were 5 of us who were directors that served under him. And then we supported a staff that had 100 coaches and about 60 other people that just supported all of the work that we were trying to do. If you don't know anything about Dallas ISD, I'll name for you. It is the 2nd largest school district in the state of Texas. And the county of Dallas alone educates 10% of all the kids in Texas. And most people know that Texas is a pretty large state. But I share that because we made one decision that transformed our entire modus operandi, for lack of better words. We decided that everyone in the department, from the top leader to the people who made our copies and made sure we had the paperwork that we needed every day, were class trained. And by that, I mean, we all went through observer training and became certified. And so, one, I just want to name that was a big step for our leader to say we're going to invest that kind of money into training and that kind of time. But ultimately, what we understood was it was important for every single member of our team and department to really understand the essence of class. Because we were going to be talking about it all the time. We were going to be referencing it all the time. We were going to be looking at class data all the time. And so we, from a logistical standpoint, we just thought, okay, this makes sense. We'll get everyone trained. Well, the story doesn't stop there, you guys, because what happened was the more we became embedded in the language of class, the more we became embedded in the tools around class, the philosophy of class, the methodology of class, just starting with 3 domains, 10 dimensions. It changed everything about how we work together because our meetings became framed in class language. Our check-ins, me checking in with my staff, them checking in with their specialists and their trainers and coaches, all of that got anchored in the use of class. Here's the truth. If you're going to implement any sort of positive team, anything, you're going to see class in it. Because to be able to build a strong working team, you've got to implement most of, if not all, of what class teaches us to do with students. Ultimately, and I can name this because I was this person, y'all. I am a Taurus. I am a Louisiana woman. There are some things about my personality that can be a little bit tenuous, and I own it, right? I own me. And there were people on our team that I could not figure out how to get along with. There were people on our team who couldn't figure out how to get along with me. And when we focused our efforts and our conversations and our framing and our language and the way we interacted with each other around class, it changed everything because it wasn't about the individual. And this is one of the most beautiful aspects of implementing the class system of tools. It's not about the teacher. It's not about the student. It is about the space in between them. So it wasn't about Dominique and it wasn't about my coworkers. It was about the space in between us because the space in between us is the interaction. And so what happened for us as a team is we became so much more efficient. We became so much more productive. We became so much more effective and all in service to and to the greater gain of the students we were serving. We had no idea that would happen. It kind of was a fluke, but making the decision that we were all going to be class observer trained gave us a whole different perspective of how we needed to engage and or interact with each other. And so the short end of it is we accomplished some very amazing things together to the benefit of the children in Dallas ISD. And I still today train my entire staff in class. Even if you're my data analyst, you go to class observer training. That's a real story. The young lady who serves right now as my data analyst goes to class, has been to and is certified in class, infant, toddler, and pre-K. And the reason I do that, obviously, you may not know this, but I currently do work in childcare. That's what my work is. But it makes sense because it's very hard for certain people, and I'm using my data analyst as the example because that's real. For a data analyst, that's a hard leap to make sometimes, right? There's a learning curve when it comes to engagement. And we all have people on our teams who consider themselves to be individual contributors. I want to stay in my box and do my work with my numbers. But what happens when you got to share those numbers? What happens when those numbers have to be socialized beyond just you and your understanding? For a lot of us, class has given us the tools to be better at interacting socially. That's not, I mean, it's a gift that I have, as I'm sure you all can see. My grandmother used to tell me as a kid, baby, I sure hope somebody pays you to talk one day. Well, here we are, right? And I share that with you all because some people are not naturally social. Some people are much better at being individual contributors to the work. They want to work on their piece, their widget, and contribute that and move on. But when teams are trying to work together, there is a level of interdependence and interconnectivity that we cannot avoid. And so class gives us so many of the tools, and even just the way we think about interactions helps us to improve those things over time. The moral of the story is, although we all kind of bellyached a little bit about having to all be class trained. I mean, hey, I was the director of instructional strategy. I didn't think I needed to be class observer trained. I was never going to do an observation, but it was transformative in giving me the perspective that I needed to really engage and interact with my staff, my teammates, my colleagues, and everyone in our department. And it really did serve us well. So I'm not suggesting that you do that. I'm just giving you an example of a real example of how the system of class transformed our ability to create a positive work environment. We all had much better job satisfaction when we were operating from an aligned place of understanding, an aligned language. And we couldn't deny the fact, and this will be my last point here, but we couldn't deny the fact that it was important that we could practice what we were preaching, because we were trying to move an entire school district in support of using the system of class. And that, my friends, is the big impact that we had. We were talking to board members who knew teachers, who knew coaches, who knew all of the people. And we were all one band with one sound because class was the language we were using to bring our message forward. So I just wanted to share that with you all briefly, just to say, we are a real life example. And if there are any of my colleagues here from Dallas, I'm happy that you've joined us. And if you ask any of them, they will tell you. All of us getting trained in the system of class, and specifically observer trained, was really the beginning of how we built a team that worked so well together that inevitably we were able to eliminate punitive disciplinary practices for our early learners. We were able to advocate and change policy in the district because we were all working in tandem and getting clear about what class wasn't, how we wanted to move that forward was a big part of that transformative change for us.
And Dominique, I like how beautiful that even, right, like the data analysts and people who are not engaging with children on a day-to-day were included in that. Somebody in the chat wrote that that really fosters that like empowerment and inclusion and that sense of community. And that's so true, right? Like every single person in the organization, no matter what your role is, we need you. We need you to be on this journey with us. We need you to speak our language. You matter. We are all in this together and we're dancing to the same beat, right? Love that. All right. I think we're ready for the next slide. All right, so Dominique shared a lot of really inspiring info from her experience, and I'm sure she could talk a lot about the specifics that she did in addition to right, the implementation of class and what that looked like. But we want to make sure that you also leave here with some little tips and strategies that you might be able to implement tomorrow, right? Implementing class and using class takes time. It is an investment. It is a very fruitful investment. And there are some things that you can do in your everyday that are not necessarily tied to class, right? So making sure that your team is the first to hear about new initiatives. When we think about well-being in a program and in our workspace, I think a lot of people tend to think about giving time and like little perks and maybe like materialistic things. And not to say that those things are not important, but there's a lot that goes into how you interact and show up that creates the wellness and the well-being for your staff, right? So prioritizing what you're picky about, right? We can't micromanage and be really strict about every single thing that we ask of our staff. So for example, lesson planning, if your teachers submit their lesson plan every week and you're able to be flexible in some of the format, right, in which that's submitted, that feels really good. Asking for feedback before implementing change. So I gave the example of that director that asked their teachers about their input for the observation protocol. Really checking in regularly with staff. Not just like, hey, how's your day going, but more specific check-ins about, I know we started implementing this new thing in our routine. How is that going for you? How are you feeling about it, right? Not just the kids, but how are you feeling about it? And how is that changing up your day? And not just jumping over to the impact on the children, but the impact on the adults, on the humans that are implementing those changes. And asking for feedback about how you're doing, right? Like feedback should be a two-way street. So bring them with you on that journey, asking them how you're doing as their leader, what their ideas are, and asking for feedback is free, right? Like that doesn't require a huge investment. Of course, it requires time, and it doesn't mean that all feedback you will be able to implement, but just the act of asking for it makes a huge difference for our workplace culture. And celebrating wins, big and small, right? This is so big, and so often we forget to do this, or we wait until big milestones or big accomplishments to celebrate. And there is a lot of small wins that we can celebrate on the day-to-day. And again, it's free to do that. So on the next slide, you can see some examples of ways that we can celebrate wins. These are more about things that you can implement tomorrow, right, in your program. Maybe some shout outs in meetings, some handwritten notes. Maybe you celebrate together when a parent shares their appreciation for how their child is growing or really enjoying their time in their classroom. That's a really important win to celebrate together. Maybe you celebrate one of your teachers who's taken time out of their day to support a newer teacher, right? That's something that you really want to encourage, and imagine how valued and awesome that teacher is going to feel that you called them out for taking time to support one of their peers. So there are so many wins in the day-to-day. We just have to look for them and find spaces and moments to just call them out. And honestly, with the challenges that you all face in your day-to-day work and how hard this work is, it's really nice also just for ourselves to remind us of how much you're doing and how much you're achieving together as a team. So in this ebook that you see on the slide, there are some more tips. It's called 3 Steps to Empower an Educator Workforce. I'm pretty sure Isabella is going to share more information about how you can access that. I actually see it in the chat. So hopefully you find some more practical strategies and tools in there.
Yeah, so I have dropped the link to this guide or this ebook in the chat. You just fill out a quick form and then you get the link to download it. And we definitely recommend, somebody sent me a question about it asking, is there any kind of resource with this information? And yes, that's this guide. And the slides from today will also be sent to you in the next couple of days. If you want the slides instead, you'll be getting both.
Any questions that people have that they want to drop in the chat for me or Dominique?
So we have a couple minutes for questions, so feel free to use the Q&A box or the chat, but we do recommend that Q&A box. I see some people have requested the guide. As long as you registered, you will be receiving an email with today's slides and the link to the guide. But if you want the guide right now, feel free to click the link that I just dropped in the chat. I see a great question coming in. What about staff that doesn't want to engage with other staff? Dominique or Claudia, do you have any advice for that situation?
Well, I use the example of my data analyst because I wouldn't say she doesn't want to engage with staff. She just really didn't see her work needing to be as interconnected and engaging with others because she literally is looking at numbers all the time. But one of the things that I would encourage if you have staff that doesn't want to engage with others is just a want. What is the requirement? And I say that as a supervisor, as someone who has to lead staff, primarily because if we focus on what we're trying to accomplish together, it tends to dissipate some of those individualized desires, wants, etc. And so my encouragement to you would be, asking the question, and Claudia mentioned this in terms of feedback. What is the thing that's causing this staff member to not want to engage with others? Are they shy? Right? We tend to forget that, adults still do exhibit social anxiety. And that's why I specifically used everybody's not naturally social. Everybody doesn't naturally know how to strike up a conversation. Sometimes we, as those social people, have to kind of be the conduit, the one who brokers those relationships. So I would encourage maybe some activities where staff do a scavenger hunt together. Maybe some activities that allow staff to engage intentionally, to encourage engagement more informally.
Yeah, and I would also encourage you to really dig to see why. What's underlying that, right? Just like with thinking about the parallel process with children, when there's a child exhibiting a certain behavior or they're withdrawing, we start to be detectives and find information and put the puzzle pieces together and really understand what's under that. The behavior is a communication, right? So that staff member not wanting to engage is just the tip of the iceberg. That's a communication, but what's driving that? So getting closer to them, just maybe one-on-one, having some conversations with them. Maybe they just had a really bad interaction with somebody, right, else on staff that turned them off, and that they're still like, they didn't have somebody to vent to about, and that's what's really driving their withdrawal. And it's not that they don't care, and it's not that they don't want to engage. So try to get in there, get close, and understand what's driving that.
So we have quite a few awesome questions coming in. Somebody made a comment about how they would love to get everybody observer trained, but the cost is just a little bit prohibitive at the moment. And on that same line, somebody asked, what strategies do you recommend for gaining buy-in to the principles of class interactions with staff who aren't able to get observer training. So I think those two kind of go hand in hand. How can we get buy-in to class principles without training yet?
Well, I'll start
Yeah.
with the response to this, and then I welcome Claudia to join in. But I will say this, and this is not going to be easy to hear for some people, but it is the reality. We really do have to ask people, what is their why when they're in this work? If their why is not connected to the growth and development of children, then we've got to ask some other questions. One of the things that I will say to you is it was not easy presenting class to a department of over 200 people. What was easy, and this is my recommendation, was sharing how the class tools really do get to student outcomes. And when we were able to leverage not work we did, work Teachstone did, because they do all the research, they keep all the stats, they have all the analysis. We leveraged what Teachstone's data showed for our buy-in. Because here was the direction we were coming from. And this was a few years ago, but I feel like we're absolutely in the same place in a lot of schools and school systems. We were being asked to cut our budget. We were being asked to find cost savings. So when we did a quick, as the leaders of the team, when we did a quick analysis, we saw that we were investing in a whole lot of different things. And it came down to, what do we want to really invest in that's going to get us where we're trying to go versus investing in so many different things? We played a game of shells for about 3 years where we were just moving things to get to the thing. And for us at the time, friends, the system of class was the thing. The positive work culture was an unintended consequence. We had no idea that was going to happen. It did, and we were grateful. But to the question of how do you get people to buy in? My question to you would be, are they bought into what you're trying to accomplish for children? If the answer to that is no, then there's some other questions to ask. But ultimately, we leveraged the effectiveness, if you will, of using class to really get students to some very specific outcomes, specifically around literacy and math.
Yeah, and I will also say, if you are not in a position where you have control over some decisions, right, over getting your staff trained on the class, observer training, etc., there are resources available to you beyond this ebook that can help you engage in that parallel process with your staff, right? Somebody in the chat said that they have organized workshops, right, with their NPD, with their staff members around it, and watch YouTube videos. Make a fun activity where you're looking at each dimension and figuring out together, like, all right, what are some ways that this looks like in our day-to-day interactions, right? Like, what are some ways that I can apply this at home with my partner, because I do that too, right? So there's a lot out there, and once you begin to see those parallels and those connections, it really just becomes like a default lens that you all share. And there are ways for you to create that with your staff, even if you're not able to go through the observer training, for sure.
Yeah, so I just shared a couple resources that I highly recommend you check out if you're getting started. First is just teachstone.com/resources. We have so many things that are free and ready to use for your educators, coaches, observers. Also want to share the blog, or not our blog. The blog is great too, but our podcast, if you go to teachstone.com/podcast, which is also shared, we have 2 shows. One is Teaching with Class, which really is all about implementing just quick, easy tips for teachers to use right away. And we have episodes of that in both Spanish and English, so you can make sure that everybody's getting what they need. And then Impacting the Classroom talks about like these bigger, broader topics. I also shared a couple links to blogs related to parallel process, as Claudia mentioned, to help you get started there. Again, we have just a couple more minutes. If you have any other questions, feel free to drop those in the Q&A. See one about splitting up a great team. What do you do when an admin wants to split up a great team in the classroom?
Oh, I love this question. And I love it because I've experienced it. I've been one of those who was asked to split, and I've been the admin asking to split. So I've lived both lives. And I will say this, it took a little bit of pushing, right, from a very dear colleague of mine. And this is when I was a classroom teacher, because I've done that too. But she helped me to understand that the reason they wanted to split us up was because we were so influential, and they wanted to be able to leverage the magic that we had in other places in the school. And initially I was just like, no, I don't want to lose my best teacher friend. Like, I love having you next door to me. I love us being able to plan together. But in the bigger picture of things, it made me really have to dig deeply and say, which of these decisions is going to really impact more kids, right? And so that's, I acquiesced and allowed the split. Not that I had a choice, but but I did, because ultimately what I realized was having her in another part of the building, me in another part of the building, us being in an opportunity to work with others was going to allow us to share with them the things we had learned and grown to know and love in working with each other. And that's exactly what happened. We both were able to build two teams of 6 people versus just the two of us kind of living and loving in our bubble, right? And so I saw the impact of that, and it was a beautiful thing.
Dominique, I just want to add, we have so many posts on LinkedIn, and in fact, we shared one today about that teacher bestie and how important it is to have those people your first year of teaching. I remember my first year of teaching, that one teacher whose classroom I went to at the end of the day when I was having a tough time with my middle schoolers. And she was such a great support. But if we had been in the same room, it would have just been all about us all the time, whereas we could be doing really great things on either side of the school. So if you want to join that conversation, I also dropped the link to that in the chat. We'd love to hear about that and how you're able to support each other and bring more people into your fold. Another question that I saw, I often coach individuals who are unwilling to negotiate their beliefs and practices to meet the needs of the whole group. Tips or tricks to melt the icy resistance? Love icy resistance. We talked a little bit about this, but anything more, Claudia or Dominique?
I'm just thinking back to what Dominique said of, well, why are they here, right? Like what is their bigger purpose? And having a conversation about what's driving that resistance. So I think, yeah, back to what we said of uh really on an individual level, understanding that person's icy resistance. Like, all right, give it to me. Tell me all of your, just sometimes letting somebody brain dump all of their frustrations and vent why they're so upset or resistant about something will do it. It's incredible how just giving them that space and that, like, you matter to me, and your resistance is not something that I'm only like upset about, but something that I care about, and just giving them that space, you'll be surprised at what happens when you do that sometimes.
Yeah, I'll simply add that on the other side of that coin, I would ask whoever posed that question to really think about, are the beliefs and practices that you're asking someone to negotiate going to impact their identity? Because ultimately, our beliefs and practices, those are the things that make us who we are. So when we're asked to negotiate those things, to the other person, it might seem like this much of an investment, but for me, if it's tied to my identity, it feels like the biggest step I'm ever being asked to take in my life. And if that is not your intent, if it is not your intent that someone sacrifice their identity for the sake of the group, if it is not your intent that someone, abandon their beliefs in a way that makes them feel like they're having to abandon themselves, then it's a conversation. And it's a conversation that allows you to meet someone with your intent and hear and understand their intent. I'm going to say this because I can. We are living in a time where that is a very real reality for people. And if we don't figure out a way to really get clear about what is my intention when I'm asking you to do this type of negotiating, then the fight is not fair. I'm actually not having a conversation with someone who is aligned with me. And so I just want to push us to think, if we're saying people don't want to, right? There's got to be a reason. Every single thing is, and we learned this from class. Emotional support is the first domain for a reason. It is the horse to the cart of classroom organization and instructional support. And so I just want to share that to say, revisit, take the opportunity to have a conversation with someone and say, hey, when I'm asking you to do this, I'm not asking you to not be you. I'm not asking you to not lean into your identity. I'm asking you to make a small change or a small sacrifice. And that's the way I see it. Do you see it differently? Right? So that we can have a conversation about it.
Yeah, that's so important. And I just shared a ton of episodes of our podcast. If you want to go dive deeper into what Dominique just said, we have some episodes of Teaching with Class that addressed how maybe naturally introverted educators can come out of their shell and be authentic to themselves. We have an episode on trauma and how your own trauma shows up in the classroom and how you can set that aside and work with kids. We have some episodes about reducing negative climate and how that's not just for your students, that's for you too. So feel free to check those out. I link to Spotify because that's what I use, but you can find them on any platform. Well, we are at the end of our time. I just want to say again, thank you so much to Claudia and Dominique. It's always such a treat to have both of you on, sharing your wisdom. You can find Claudia and Dominique's contact information here. They're also both on LinkedIn. We recommend that if you haven't already to join the class learning committee or community, I'm sorry, I'll share the link to that in the email that you'll be receiving here in the next day or so. And then check out that guide. We have a lot of free information there to help you get started. And hopefully you'll take it a step further and get people into the class itself. But in the meantime, we're just really excited to have you here and talking about interactions with us. So thank you again, everyone.
Thanks, y'all. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, you all have a great afternoon. Thank you, everyone.